With this video, we'll continue our discussion of the ethics of St. Thomas Aquinas. Last time we saw that Thomistic ethics is teleological, like Aristotle. That is to say, its ultimate orientation is towards the ultimate end, which in Aquinas, as we saw, is God. It's in God that all ethical action, all ethical thought is ultimately going to be directed. But that's ultimate. There's a lot going on at the level of the intermediate here as well. And at this intermediate level, we find Aquinas giving a prominent place, as you would expect a Christian philosopher to do, to the notion of law. So in this video, we'll talk about the basic concept of law and its attributes, and also the four basic types of law. And it's important that these are not separate classes, that we shouldn't think of the four types of law as dividing up a pie, but rather as concentric circles. So in other words, we're not talking about this kind of picture where you have the domain of law and then it's divided somehow into these four different segments, but rather it's going to be something more like this. Where the different types of law are going to be nested within one another from the general to the more specific. This isn't quite 100% accurate for reasons that will become apparent later on, but this gives a closer picture than this one. So we should erase this one from our mind. When we're thinking of four different types, they're not really separate from each other. They're not completely separate. They're rather nested or embedded in one another in this way. So please keep that in mind. Now, the background to this discussion of law. I already mentioned the Aristotelian context, but I want to place a different emphasis on that now. Here, I think we can use the concept of law as a way of keeping in mind, keeping as a point of reference, the essential objectivity of the Thomistic conception of ethics. Ethics is a matter of law, and law is something that is objective. There's not such a thing as a subjective law. Laws carry with it the notion of objectivity, and so that's a useful reason to focus on the concept of law. And one of the reasons that Thomistic ethics is often associated with natural law theory, which actually is probably more often connected with jurisprudence and philosophy of law in the sense of the legal system that you study in law school rather than an ethical theory. But obviously there's a relationship here. So we can describe this as a kind of natural law ethic. It's probably more accurate to describe it as a Thomistic Aristotelian ethical theory, just to be more specific and to avoid confusion with other things that might be called natural law theory. But you'll sometimes see it referred to that way. And so that's what the connection is. But this basic idea of objectivity is also present in Aristotle, as we saw, that in an Aristotelian context, ethical theory is about objective facts about the good. Objective facts about the good. It's not about, as we often tend to speak of ethics in the modern age, as about people's values. That is a very anachronistic way to think about Aristotelian ethics, whether it's Aristotle's ethics or whether it's Thomas Aquinas' ethics. In both cases, we're not dealing with values. Values don't exist in the Aristotelian or the Thomistic world. They're invented much later, in the late 19th, early 20th century. There's no such thing as values in the modern sense. Rather, instead, what there is the good. The good. And we're concerned in ethical theory with grounding objective facts about the good, one could say. truths about the good would be more accurate still. And the good is part of nature. The good is in nature. It's related to essence, and essence is part of nature. So this notion of essence, in other words, has an internal relationship to good, and also, as we saw in Aristotle, to the notion of the ends of something. So this is a conceptual complex here, the essence of thing. What's the essence of a thing? The essence is simply what it is. It's nature. So the things in nature have a nature. Trees have a certain nature. It belongs to the nature of, let's say, an oak tree to lose its leaves in the fall and to have new leaves bloom in the spring. That belongs to what it is to be an oak tree. That belongs to the essence of the oak tree. And as well as other things, right? There are many things, a long list of things that belong to the essence of an oak tree. And likewise, there are things that belong to the essence of a human being, that belong to the essence of all of the different things in nature. Now, it's an interesting question. I just say this as kind of a footnote in case some of you are thinking it, and also because I happen to be interested in it. How this notion that there are essences in nature, that there are things that things essentially are in nature, is affected by evolutionary theory. I give examples of living creatures, and we might well wonder, is it the case that we don't have essences anymore because of the fluidity of species? Some modern philosophers have suggested that that is the case. I don't think that, at least it's obvious that that is the case. I mean, even if it is the case that, let's say, human beings evolved from higher primates, there still is something it is to be a chimpanzee and something it is to be a human being. They have separate essences, even if there were, in the course of natural history, intermediate stages, let's say. And so other questions might be raised about the ethical significance of natural law in light of evolutionary theory, and we'll try to talk about some of those when we talk about natural law in a future video. But for now, I just wanted to throw that out there and just express the basic idea that from the Aristotelian Thomistic perspective, it's a kind of basic tenet of science that things in nature have essences. If they didn't have essences, there would be no point to scientific investigation, because what would you be investigating? To say that things don't have essences would be to imply that things don't, as it were, stay still long enough to be investigated by science, that they're constantly changing their basic nature. So this presupposition that things have essences is part of a basic objective or realistic outlook on reality, the world, nature. And the good is part of that. Because to say that a thing has a certain essence also is to say that there is such a thing as what is good for the thing given its essence. So given the essence of an oak tree, it's good for it to be planted somewhere where there's a sufficient water source, sufficient sunlight. And it's bad for an oak tree to be planted in the Sahara Desert or someplace like that. It's not going to survive. So that's the basic idea. And it's not controversial. It shouldn't be controversial, even though nowadays we tend to think that the idea of objective ethics is somehow highly controversial. From a Thomistic Aristotelian perspective, it's important to see that this is something that was regarded as obvious and to be taken for granted, that things have essences and therefore there's a good for those things. Now, it's a separate question, of course, whether things like justice and so on are entirely conventional, and those are separate questions down the road, but at least at some level it was understood that there is a kind of natural good that serves as a bedrock. And once you add the idea of a deity onto that picture, you get some interesting ethical consequences, as we'll see, and really as we've already seen in the first video on Aquinas. So part of this view is that there's a natural teleology, that there are objective final causes. So I'll introduce those notions as well, the notion of natural teleology. and objective final causes. So teleology just refers to the system of teloi, this Greek word is the telos, which is just a final cause or an end. So final cause and the same thing as an end. So natural teleology is to say there's a natural system of teloses, which is plural teloi, that is to say of objective final causes or ends. There are, in Thomas's terms, what he will call ways in which things are inclined. And I think nowadays we have given a subjective connotation to this notion of inclination. We say, what do you want to do this afternoon? And you say, well, you know what? I'm inclined to just stay at home and watch TV or whatever, which means I have a kind of subjective impulse or feeling or something like that. And that's not what Thomas means. By inclination, he means something more like, the way in which a building might be objectively leaning in a certain direction, is inclined in that direction. So it's a kind of natural orientation. In other words, this is the way nature has, as it, so to speak, purposes for us. We don't want to anthropomorphize nature here, but it's that kind of idea. It's sort of, regardless of what you might want to do, nature has its own purposes for you. You might think, it would be desirable for you to stay awake for the next 72 hours studying for your midterm. But nature has inclined you in a different direction. That might not be your inclination in the subjective sense, but in this Thomistic sense, that there are certain natural facts about you that incline you in a certain direction. And similarly, there's going to be certain natural facts about us that lead us towards certain ends. And these are the objective final causes that exist in us. As we'll see in Thomas's account, the distinction of human beings is that we are able to recognize through our intellect, through our rational intellect, that we have these certain natural dispositions or inclinations, these sort of objective ends that our organism is directed towards, which of course is going to include things that are purely animal in nature, like nourishment and reproduction, but are also going to include higher ends, like the ones that Aquinas mentioned in the opening questions that we looked at last time. But these are things that don't just incline us in a certain way, but that we can also recognize incline us in a certain way. And therefore, we have the capacity to choose to cooperate with them or not. The non-human animals don't have that choice. They just act in the way in which they are inclined. So there's just a certain way that your dog is going to behave by virtue of the fact that it's a dog, and those are different from the way a moth behaves by virtue of the fact that it's a moth. And it just behaves that way. It doesn't choose to behave that way. It just does. And these can, in principle, be studied scientifically. And that's what enables us, of course, as human beings, to be reflective and to realize certain objective ends that we are subject to, or that subject us to them, might be a better way to put it. And then we can understand that these are part of the essence of the biological organism that we are, and we can cooperate with them, we can endorse them, we can go along with them, and so forth. Or we could try to fight against them. So that's what creates this sort of ethical dimension to the natural ends, the natural teleology that Aquinas is going to point to. So this notion of natural teleology leads to a notion of natural goodness, a normative notion of the natural. So we can discover things about nature that we can state in terms that also imply a kind of goodness or perfection. For example, we can say things like, a dog has 4 legs. And by this, we don't mean all dogs have 4 legs, because of course, Some of you might have a dog who lost a leg or had a birth defect and doesn't have 4 legs. That doesn't falsify the claim that a dog has 4 legs, nor does this claim mean just one dog has 4 legs. It's a general, really a universal claim. How is it possible to say this? Well, it's possible because there's a certain norm that implies what the telos of a dog is, what the end of a dog is, and that involves the good of a dog, what's good for a dog, what a perfected organism that comes as a dog would be like, and it would have 4 legs. And so that's this idea. So there's a kind of natural goodness, and we can see immediately the ethical and potential ethical importance of this, because if that's also true of us as human beings, if there's a kind of natural goodness, what it is to be a good human being, what it is to be good qua human being, then this suggests the possibility of an ethical norm that's derived from objective truths, objective biological truths, we can almost say, as long as we don't have too narrow a conception of biology, but objective truths about what it is to be the kind of organism we are. So objective moral truth then could potentially flow from what we might describe as Aristotelian biology. However, in a departure from Aristotle, the ultimate end is supernatural for Aquinas. Only satisfaction of the will, as we saw in the last video, will provide rest for the appetite's desire for fulfillment. And this only satisfaction of the will is found in the supernatural, is found in God, ultimately. No finite thing, no particular thing could ever fully satisfy the will. We saw the argument for that last time, so I won't repeat that here, but I just know that this is something that is an add-on to the basic Aristotelian framework that I've been explicating so far. So the natural ends of the human being are what we might call Aristotle plus. There are objective natural ends, in the same way that Aristotle thought that there are objective natural ends that determine the human being, that we saw in the function argument, for example, of Aristotle. But their ultimate explanation is going to be theological. Why does the human being function in the way it functions, to use that kind of language? Well, the Thomistic answer is going to be because ultimately we're directed towards a kind of union with God. And our lives are the way they are because it's part of a larger plan that ultimately aims at the telos, or the final cause, or the end of union with God. And that's where our human telos, our human end, our human good ultimately is going to rest, is in God. Now, if you state this Aristotelian biology in terms of laws, you get what Aquinas calls natural law. Natural law. So what is the Thomistic notion of natural law? It's unfortunate that nowadays, when we hear natural law, we think of the laws of nature, supposedly, right? Like, the laws of gravity and thermodynamics and electromagnetism and relativity and this sort of thing. And this is related, it's, as you might expect, it's got a historical genealogy that traces back to what Thomas is talking about here. But especially in the context in which we're using it, natural law is going to be closer to what we would call moral law or an ethical precept. And it has the advantage, a good of this terminology is that it does have a connotation for us of objectivity that is appropriate to Thomistic ethical theory. Natural law is not something that's liable to mislead us into thinking we're talking about subjective values, subjective moral values, or anything like that. But, of course, it has the misleading implication that we're liable to associate this with something like a mechanistic physical process, and that's not the case. So this is the moral law for Aquinas, essentially. Ethical precepts, norms, obligations, duties. That's what the natural law is. So it's not totally unrelated to the modern sense. Also, this is going to be rooted in reason. and also rooted in certain natural facts. And these are ways in which it is indeed connected to the modern notion of natural law, rooted in reason and rooted in natural facts. For Aquinas, human beings are beings who have an intellect. And this intellect is capable of discerning the good. It's capable of discerning, perceiving the essences of things in nature, and thereby discerning what's objectively good for these things. It has to investigate, study, experience, and so on. But this experience isn't just a matter of sort of passively receiving sense data, as a modern empiricist might say, but rather it's a capacity for judgment and discernment that abstracts the essences of things, and that thereby comes to understand what the objective good of things is in understanding those essences. So our intellect does this, and then our will, for Aquinas, is naturally inclined towards the good. So intellect discerns the good. Will is inclined toward the good. The will, of course, is our motive force. It's related to the Aristotelian idea of a decision that one makes, or a choice. That's the conclusion of a process of practical reasoning. But for Aquinas, the intellect and the will in the human being are natural facts as much as anything else. And the will, like anything in nature, has a certain natural teleology of its own. It has a certain natural end that it's directed towards. And this is the good. And we can see once again the Aristotelian lineage here. Remember that Aristotle too thought that the end is naturally, that action is directed towards, is naturally a good. Of course, the intellect of the particular individual might have a mistaken conception of what's really good. And so they're pursuing something that's good that isn't really good. But the idea here is that they at least have the conception of the thing as good. That the will is inherently ordered towards pursuing the good, the concept of the good, and it has various mistaken conceptions sometimes about what is good and what isn't. But nonetheless, it's trying to achieve the good. It just happens to be mistaken about what the good really is. And that's the idea, that the natural orientation of things is towards the good in that way. And so, since for Aquinas, God is the ultimate source of everything, divine law is ultimately rooted in the intellect and the will of God. Aquinas' ethic is therefore theologically based, but it's best seen as the ensconcing of an Aristotelian ethical framework within an Abrahamic monotheistic theological context. So it's both theological and Aristotelian. It's Aristotelian plus. You think of Aristotle's system, and then take Aristotle's ethical orientation and stick it within a broader context of a theological, and specifically an Abrahamic monotheistic theological conception of reality. And then that's when you get Thomistic Aristotelian ethics. And so it's theologically based, and that of course is going to change things in myriad ways within the Aristotelian portion of the system. Once you embed it in a kind of theological context, the meaning of Aristotle doesn't remain the same. It's going to change systematically throughout, but it's still recognizably Aristotelian. Now, just a quick footnote. Theologically based ethics has a reputation of being reducible to the commandment, do X because God tells you to do X, right? We think of theological ethics as being a kind of divine command ethic that bases ethics on some idea of what God tells you to do. And at one level, Aquinas does have a view like that. But he has what is arguably the most sophisticated and most viable form of a theologically based ethics, namely natural law theory, which relies on a more complex arrangement than the crude theological ethic that you find in divine command theory or what's known as theological voluntarism. Some people might object to my characterization of that as crude, but it's crude in the sense that it seems to run right into the classic Euthyphro dilemma from Plato's Euthyphro. If you don't know what that is, you can check out my video on this in the Plato playlist on the Euthyphro. But the basic idea of the Euthyphro dilemma is if you say that the basic moral principle is to do what God commands, then you're faced with a dilemma because you have to ask the question, well, does God command what he commands because it's good, or is it good merely because he commands it? If the former, if God commands what he commands because it's good, then it turns out that this ethical theory is incomplete, and one might argue that it's even rather superfluous because you still haven't explained, well, what makes God command what he commands? You still haven't given an account of what goodness is such that God chooses the things that he chooses, because he chooses them supposedly because they're good. So what is goodness? And you can't explain it in terms of what God commands because you've opted for the other alternative possibility. Of course, you could take the second alternative, or the original dilemma, and just say, well, things are good merely because God commands them. But that seems to most people to lead to absurd consequences, such as if God, changes his mind, or if you have a more sophisticated view and you say, well, God has decreed ethical laws from all eternity. If you say, well, if God had from all eternity decreed that, let's say, torturing babies is good, would that have made torturing babies good? And that seems to be an absurd consequence. So that's the Euthyphro dilemma that divine command theory seems to be subject to. Now, the advantage of this kind of natural law theory is that Aquinas is going to argue, as we'll see, that moral laws are ultimately based upon what's naturally good for human beings. That is to say, what's rooted in our nature or our essence, rooted in the kinds of beings we are. And that is something that is necessary. As necessary, it's not something that even God could change. Now, of course, God could have decided not to create human beings, or he could wipe out all human beings. But if there are human beings, what's good for human beings is necessary because it belongs to their nature. So God could no more make it good for you to act contrary to your human nature than he could make a circle have straight sides. Not even God can perform contradictory acts. And this is no limitation on God's power, on the traditional understanding, because power is merely the ability to do everything that's a thing. Another way to put this is to do everything that's possible. But a circle, put it this way, a circle with straight sides isn't a thing. So the fact that God can't create a circle with straight sides isn't to say that there's something he can't do, because a circle with straight sides isn't a thing. So there's in the class of things that God cannot do, there's still empty, still an empty class. Similarly, to make it good, let's say, for people to eat their children, that goes against our human nature, one could argue. It goes against the natural law in that sense. And God couldn't make that good for human beings because that would violate human nature. So it's got the same status as making a circle with straight sides. So that's the idea. Now, as we'll see, ultimately, all natural law is ensconced in this thing that Aquinas will call the eternal law, which is God's plan. And so ultimately, in endorsing and cooperating with and following the natural law, one is obeying God's command. And so there is a kind of truth in theological voluntarism or divine command theory, but it's a partial and misleading truth. The truth is that ethics is a matter of following divine commands. The misleading aspect of it is that the good is just something that is arbitrarily commanded by God. Arbitrarily meaning here that there's no separate account of why it's good that can be given for it. Okay, so that's a very quick, just sort of introductory caution, because I think we are liable to think of theological ethics in a particular way. And so I want to caution us at the outset that Thomistic ethics is both theological to its core, but then also it's very different from the stereotype of what we tend to think of as a theological ethic, because it's not a divine command theory, theological voluntarism theory in the traditional sense. Okay, let's go to question 90, the essence of law. Article 1, whether law is something pertaining to reason. And so what we see here is that Aquinas makes a conceptual connection between the concept of law and the concept of reason. You can't give an account of what law is without referring to reason. And I think it's also true to say that you can't give an account of reason, ratio in Latin, right? So we get rationality, reason, ratio, rationality. And of course, we can see in this word here, right, this is the English word ratio, which is a mathematical term, right? A measure, a certain type of measure of a thing. And the idea of measure implies the idea of a standard, which implies the idea of a law. So the notion of law is internal to reason, but we could also say that the notion of reason is internal to law. Aquinas says here in his answer to Article 1, whether law is something pertaining to reason, I answer that law is a rule and measure of acts, whereby man is induced to act or is restrained from acting. For lex, law, is derived from ligare, to bind, because it binds one to act. Now, the rule and measure of human acts is the reason, the first principle of human acts. That is to say, what makes a human act a human act, or even an act properly so called, rather than just a natural reaction, is reason. That the human action is an action based upon reason. Another way to put it would be to say that if your action is recognizable as a human action, I must be able to ask, why did you do that? And what I'm asking for is the reason, the justification. You could explain to me, what were you thinking? In other words, what justification were you giving yourself when you acted in that way? Of course, sometimes we act unthinkingly, but in the paradigm case, the things that we regard as acts most fully so called are acts that are based upon reason, meaning that they have a reason for them. Law binds one to the act, he says. Law is a binding. Law binds acts. So he says the rule and measure of law is reason, which is the first principle of human acts, as is evident from what has been stated above, since it belongs to reason to direct to the end, which is the first principle in all matters of action, according to the philosopher. So reason selects the ends that you're pursuing. And that, of course, goes along with what I was saying earlier, that when you perform an action, it always makes sense. It's always possible to ask you, why did you perform that action? And typically what we are asking, when we're asking, well, what were you thinking of? What did you have in mind? We're asking, what was the end that you were pursuing? What were you hoping to achieve? What was the end that you were pursuing in that action? Reason directs the end, which is the first principle, and so forth. So, but there's this idea here of binding. Law is a binding. That's the essence of law, is to be a binding. And when we're acting according to reason, meaning that our action is bound to something, and which he here is identifying with the end that we're pursuing. So What distinguishes us from non-human animals is that we act on reason. In acting on reason, what we're doing is we're binding ourselves to a certain end that serves as the rule and measure for our action. One further brief comment on this idea that's the rule and measure. In other words, if you want to assess was my action successful or not, what you need to do is to see whether you achieved your end. In that sense, the end serves as the rule and measure of your action. So if you want to determine whether or not your action of constructing a house was successful, you have to see, well, is this actually a building I can live in? That's what serves as the rule and measure of my action, of its success or failure, as the kind of action it is or was purporting to be. And that has the character of a law, he wants to say. There's a kind of standard here that governs your action and that provides it with its rule and its measure. So that's the basic character of law. It's connected to reason, act, and end in that way. And in responding to the first objection, Aquinas distinguishes two applications of the term law. He says, since law is a kind of rule and measure, it may be something in two ways. First, as in that which measures and rules. And since this is proper to reason, it follows that in this way, law is in the reason alone. Second, as in that which is measured and ruled. In this way, law is in all those things that are inclined to something by reason of some law, so that any inclination arising from a law may be called a law, not essentially, but by participation, as it were. And thus the inclination of the members to concupiscence is called the law of the members. So, in other words, we can talk about law as what is actually doing the directing of the action, your reason, or we can also talk about a law-like action, a regular action, a rational action. That is the thing that's subjected to the law. And so law can be either expressed in the sense of what's giving the direction, the measure, the reason, or what is being imposed upon by reason. Can also be described as participating in law. So there's a kind of an active and a passive sense of law, or we might say law-likeness, that's in play here. Article 2, whether the law is always something directed to the common good. The argument here is as follows. Premise 1, the law is the rule and measure of human acts. Premise 1, the law is the rule and measure of human acts. Premise 2, human acts have their first principle in the last end, which is happiness. Premise 2, human acts have their first principle in the last end, which is happiness. And that was discussed in the previous video. Premise 3, hence the law is directed toward happiness. Premise 3, hence the law is directed toward happiness. Premise 4, the single person is related to the community as the imperfect to the perfect. Premise 4, the single person is related to the community as the imperfect to the perfect. Conclusion, hence the perfect happiness is the communal happiness. So once again, this is the argument he's giving for this conclusion that the law is, in fact, always something directed to the common good. Law is the rule and measure of human acts. Human acts have their first principle in the last end, which is happiness. Hence, the law is directed toward happiness. The single person is related to the community as the imperfect to the perfect, and hence the perfect happiness is the communal happiness. I think here pretty clearly probably the most questionable premise is the fourth one here, that the single person is related to the community as the imperfect to the perfect. There's a presumption here that the happiness of the community is more perfect than the happiness of the individual. This becomes a very important principle in utilitarianism. As we'll see in our next sequence of videos on J.S. Mill's utilitarianism. You might also be familiar with this idea from Star Trek, Mr. Spock, right? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, which Spock says logic clearly dictates. So he would apparently agree with Aquinas here on this point. But something like that is what he means by this, is that the single person is incomplete. The community is the completion that the single person is a part of, right? So you're part of this larger corporate entity, so to speak, that is your completion as a person. So the law is going to be then directed towards the perfection, that's the implication, of the community as a whole. It's the happiness of the community as a whole. That's the complete good of human acts, is the happiness of the community as a whole. We can see how very Aristotelian this notion is. Aquinas concludes that this directedness toward the general is essential to law. It's essential to law. So law always has this generality to it. It's aiming towards the common good. It's aiming towards some general outcome of action. And any precept that doesn't have this generality will not have the form of law for him. If you look at the second half there of his answer in Article 2, moreover, since every part is ordained to the whole as imperfect to perfect, and since one man is part of the perfect community, the law must needs regard properly the relationship to universal happiness. Wherefore the philosopher in the above definition of legal matters mentions both happiness and the body politic, for he says that we call those legal matters just, which are adapted to produce and preserve the happiness and its parts for the body politic. Hence the state is the perfect community. So there we see his official aligning himself with Aristotle. Now, in every genus, that which belongs to it chiefly is the principle of the others, and the others belong to that genus in subordination to that thing. Thus, fire, which is chief among hot things, is the cause of heat in mixed bodies, and these are said to be hot insofar as they have a share of fire. Consequently, since the law is chiefly ordained to the common good, any other precept in regard to some individual work must needs be devoid of the nature of a law, save insofar as it regards the common good. Therefore, every law is ordained to the common good. So the idea here seems to be that you might have what he's calling your precepts. You might have like rules of thumb that you follow for yourself in your own life. Counsels of prudence, for example. I never go out on a cloudy day except with an umbrella or whatever. But those don't have the character of law because they're not directed towards the common good. That's the idea. So there's more to being a law than merely being a rule or precept, even one that's followed. Because a particular individual can follow some counsels of prudence in one kind or another, like always carrying an umbrella or whatever on a cloudy day. And those aren't laws because they're not aimed at the common good. So that's the basic idea. Now, does this imply that the law can't be concerned with particular matters? Well, not at all. Of course, that would be an absurd conception of law if it said that you could be concerned with particular matters. We have all sorts of laws that are concerned with particular matters. It just concerns particular matters insofar as they pertain to the common good. So if you're watching this video right now on your phone and you're driving on the freeway, the law requires that you should stop right now and keep your eyes on the road. That's a very particular matter, but it's a particular matter that pertains to the common good because that law is there to reduce traffic fatalities and perhaps digestion of lecture videos at the last minute. Okay, Article 3, whether the reason of man is competent to make laws. So reason is something that all human beings possess. Law is rooted in reason. And thus it might seem that every human being is competent to make laws. Of course, for modern people, this sounds very close to the sort of democratic ideal that we would favor. Everyone's a law unto themselves. And even in the Middle Ages, there were grounds for an expansive view of who has the power to make laws. You can look at all three of the objections, suggest aspects of this. So objection 1, it would seem that the reason of any man is competent to make laws. For the apostle says that when the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature those things that are of the law, they are a law to themselves. Now he says this of all in general. Therefore, anyone can make a law for himself. Further, as the philosopher says, the intention of the lawgiver is to lead men to virtue, but every man can lead another to virtue. Therefore, the reason of any man is competent to make laws. Further, just as the sovereign of a state governs the state, so every father of a family governs his household. But the sovereign of a state can make laws for the state. Therefore, every father of a family can make laws for his household. Despite this apparent endorsement by eminent authorities, Aquinas builds upon the view of the law in the previous article to argue that only the people as a whole, or their vice-regent, that is someone acting in the name of the whole people, only that person can properly make a law. Thus, in reply to the first objection, Aquinas reveals the sense in which individuals are laws unto themselves. We're laws unto ourselves only by participating in the law and sharing the direction of the one who rules him. Essentially, we're laws unto ourselves when we use our reason and our will to direct ourselves according to the law. That's the sense in which we're law unto ourselves, not by making laws for ourselves. So because a law is for the common good, individuals can't make laws for themselves because I can't make a law for the common good myself. Only someone who is empowered and has an office that empowers them, that invests them with the authority to make laws for the community can, properly speaking, make a law. Because only they are able to make it for the common good. So that's the point he's making there. So this article, by the way, has nothing to do with who's qualified to be a vice-regent in this sense. In that sense, everyone might be, one might hold that everyone's qualified. Aquinas is silent on that issue here. But he's just saying that the only person who's qualified is the person who is in the position of the vice-regent. And of course, this might be a collective body. It could be the Congress or whatever, the Parliament as well. Article 4, whether promulgation is essential to a law. So promulgation is the law has to be announced, made public. And for Aquinas, there are no hidden or secret laws. There's no such thing as a hidden or secret law. A law that would be kept secret would be no law at all. A law by its very nature needs to be promulgated. So he explains this as follows. A law is imposed on others by way of a rule and measure. Now, a rule or measure is imposed by being applied to those who are ruled and measured by it. Wherefore, in order that a law obtain the binding force which is proper to a law, it must needs be applied to men who have to be ruled by it. Such an application is made by its being notified to them by promulgation. Wherefore, promulgation is necessary for the law to obtain its force. So, we think here, again, back to this idea that the law serves as a measure, as a ratio, as a measure, as a rational measure of one's action. If you think about the metaphor here, try to measure something using, let's say, a tape measure or a ruling stick. If someone has hidden the tape measure or the ruling stick from you, right? I'm going to measure something. My measure is, let's say, a ruler or a let's say a yardstick, because I wanted to have something without ambiguity. So a yardstick. I've got a yardstick. Sorry for you people who aren't in the United States. I got a yardstick, and I'm going to measure something by a yardstick, but the yardstick has been hit. Someone took it and hid it from me. Well, is that a useful measure? No, not anymore. Not until it becomes public and available to me. And similarly, that's what Aquinas is saying here. The law needs to be made available in order to serve as the measure, because that's its function, is to serve as the measure, the rule and the measure of action. And so to be imposed on those who are to be ruled by it, it has to be promulgated to them. Okay, and here we get the definition of law, which is right here in black and white in our text. So I won't write it down, but it is easily overlooked because he sticks it in here at the end of the answer of the fourth article of this question. But here's the definition of law. The definition of law. So these are the conditions. It's an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. So those are the four conditions. 5 conditions. Ordinance of reason for the common good, made for the care of the community, and promulgated. I'm not really sure whether I should say ordinance of reason is 2 or 4. So maybe ordinance of reason for the common good by someone who has a care for the community and promulgated. So maybe 4 conditions, depending on whether you think of the ordinance part and the reason part as being 2 or 1. But so what he's gone through here, of course, in these articles precisely is to lay out specifically what the aspects of this definition refer to. So it should be clear at this point what a law is. Okay. Question 91. Let's bring this up real quick here. The various kinds of law. So here we get the account of the 4 kinds of law. There's the eternal law, the natural law, the human law, and the divine law. And with these first 3, there's definitely a pretty clear nesting. Like this. So the broadest sort of circle is the eternal law. Nested within that is the natural law as a subset. And nested within that is going to be the human law in a way that I'll explain. And then the divine law is like the human law. It's unclear whether to put this as a subset of, whether we could put this as a subset of the human law. Probably not. And we can't exactly put this as something that is under the natural law either, because it's a kind of supplement to the natural law. So this one has a kind of special status. Doesn't really fit into this scheme as well, but it is still going to be related in a way that will be made clear that it's a kind of dependent on the larger context. So it's not a separate piece of the pie in the way that I ruled out earlier. So these are going to be related in this kind of nested or ensconcing fashion. Okay. Whether there is an eternal law, Article 1. This is the supreme law. The eternal law is the supreme law emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community, namely God. The idea of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe. That's the eternal law. The idea of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe. So the eternal law is the plan, the big plan, God's plan, the divine blueprint, the master code that lays out the complete scheme of organization for the totality of creation. So that's going to include, to go back to what I mentioned earlier, is the essences of things, natural teleology, all this kind of stuff. It's going to, this eternal law is the setting of the ends of everything, the blueprint of everything. It includes God's ultimate providence, the master code of his creation, the ultimate algorithm, if you will. However, essential as it is, the concept of eternal law seems to have some paradoxical implications that give rise to the 3 objections. So it would seem that there is no eternal law because every law is imposed on someone, but there is not someone from eternity on whom a law could be imposed. since God alone was from eternity. Therefore, no law is eternal. How can there be an eternal law? Because God alone is eternal. Does God impose a law on himself? As we'll see, Aquinas will say, no, that's not the case. So how can there be a law that is eternal? And here, his response is to say that those things that are not in themselves exist with God, inasmuch as they are foreknown and preordained by him. According to Romans 4:17, who calls those things that are not as those that are. Accordingly, the eternal concept of the divine law bears the character of an eternal law, insofar as it is ordained by God to the government of things foreknown by him. So that's obviously obscure, theologically laden passage, but what he seems to have in mind here is that, before the creation of the world, God knew you. Familiar biblical thought, right? So God foreknew everything that was going to be part of his creation, even before it existed. From eternity, God knew what would transpire in time. And so that's the sense in which the law is eternal. It's the eternal blueprint. And so even though God is the only truly eternal thing, the law is eternal in the sense that it was about or referred to things that would exist in time before they existed from all eternity. So that's how he replies to that. The first objection. The second is also interesting. It piggybacks off this notion of promulgation that we just talked about. Promulgation, it seems, could not be from eternity. So how could this law be promulgated? He says, because the divine word and the writing of the book of life are eternal. The divine word, so the divine word, of course, is the second person of the Trinity, which is eternal, but it also refers to sort of the word of God in general. So the divine word, which is the seat of the eternal law, exists from eternity, and it has the character of speech in some sense. It's obscure, of course, but so that's a kind of promulgation. The law was promulgated from all eternity in the divine word. Mystical sounding thing, but that's one of the things he says. And then more down to earth, I would say, relatively speaking, is when he says the writing of the book of life are eternal. The book of life is in Judaism and Christianity is the book in which the names of the just are written, right? Those who are going to be awarded eternal life in the afterlife, whose names are written in the book of life. And that's something eternal. So he seems to be endorsing a kind of view of predestination here. But the promulgation cannot be from eternity on the part of the creature that hears or reads. So the writings in the book of life are eternal in the sense that God knows in advance what the destiny is. I want to be careful here. I'm not sure. Depends on technically what you mean by predestination, whether that's a view of predestination. It certainly is a foreknowledge of the destiny of things. That seems to be part of the view. Okay, I think for time we'll skip the third objection there. So that gives you some sense of the eternal law, and we'll return back to this in the next video. Article 2, whether there is in us a natural law. This is the most important type of law for ethical theory. We see the biblical root and warrant in the famous quote from Romans 2:14. When the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature those things that are of the law. Although they have no written law, yet they have the natural law, whereby one knows and is conscious of what is good or evil. A gloss on Romans 2:14. So this is part of Paul's account of why no human being has any excuse for being sinful. Someone, of course, might say, hey, wait a minute, I'm a Gentile. I never heard the law of Moses. How could I have known that I was violating the Ten Commandments? And Paul's answer is, you have this law that's written on your hearts as part of your human nature. And so that's the important biblical connection that Aquinas makes explicitly here between his natural law ethic and the Christian ethic. So this is the most important type of law for ethical theory. The natural law is the human beings partaking of the eternal reason of God, the eternal law. So that's why I put this as embedded in here in this way. So this is the eternal law, this outermost circle. And the natural law is the human beings partaking of the eternal law. So it's our portion. If all of this is the eternal law, the natural law is the human beings partaking of the eternal law. Through our reason. Our reason, as it were, participates in God's reason and thereby comes to know the natural law. That's the account. So in his answer, he writes, as stated above, law as being a rule and measure can be in a person in two ways. In one way, as in him that rules and measures. In another way, as in that which is ruled and measured, since a thing is ruled and measured insofar as it partakes of the rule and measure. Wherefore, since all things subject to divine providence are ruled and measured by the eternal law, as was stated above, it is evident that all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted on them, they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. That is to say, all things, your pet dog partakes of the eternal law in the sense that the eternal law is the blueprint, the plan, and the dog's part of the plan. Otherwise, he wouldn't exist. So everything partakes in that sense. But human beings have a special status. So he continues, now, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident both for itself and for others. Wherefore, it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end, and this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So that's what I was referring to earlier, that we not only act in accordance with the natural law, but we act in accordance with our idea of the natural law, or at least we can. We have the capacity to. Through the natural light of reason, the human being is able to discern aspects of God's plan, merely through natural reason now. So this is something that you don't need special divine revelation for according to Aquinas. The Canaanites or whomever who were engaging in child sacrifice had the ability to know that that was wrong, that was counter to the natural law. That's the point he's making here. So we're able to discern this through our natural reason. We didn't need to have Moses come down with the Ten Commandments to tell us, thou shalt not kill. And we see the concentric nature here in response to the first objection. The first objection says, it would seem that there is no natural law in us because man is governed sufficiently by the eternal law. For as Augustine says, you see the quote there, and so basically, he cites what became known later as Occam's razor, although he's citing it here. Nature does not abound in superfluities, as neither does she fail in necessities. That is, nature doesn't have superfluous things that, are extra add-ons that it doesn't need. So if you already have the eternal law, why do we need the natural law too? And his response is precisely to say that the natural law isn't anything different from the eternal law. So his reply, he says, that would be a good objection if the natural law were something different from the eternal law, whereas it's nothing but a participation thereof. That is to say, it's nothing but a part of the eternal law. Our participation in it through our human intellect, which of course is partial because we don't see the whole plan. That will become clearer as he gets into more detail about the eternal law, which we'll cover in the next video. Article 3, whether there is a human law. So the distinction between natural law and human law. And here is Aquinas taking up this issue that cropped up in Plato's Gorgias, in Socrates' dispute with the Sophists, also at the end of Aristotle's discussion of justice. And there, the distinction was framed between nature and convention. and it tended to be framed in terms of an exclusive opposition and a dispute over the metaphysical status of ethics. Is ethics conventional or is it natural? Or justice in particular. Is justice conventional or is it natural? And in Aquinas, the relation of natural law and human law is different. Aquinas sees human law, which we might think of as the conventional laws, he sees this as the specification or the filling in of the generalities of the natural law. So that's why, again, I have this embedded, number 3 here, which refers to the human law, is embedded within the natural law, rendering it more specific. He compares this to the relationship of the metaphysical foundation of physical science to the particular discoveries of physical investigations. So, nowadays we're more liable to think of, let's say, the relationship between logic and physics. Whatever your physical theory is, we at least know it has to be logically coherent. If it's not a logically consistent, coherent theory, if the math doesn't add up, it's not going to count, regardless of what the data is, right? In fact, you can assume a priori that you're not going to find data confirming a theory that's like that. And so similarly, but at the same time, merely, having the idea of a logically consistent framework isn't going to tell you anything about specifically what nature is like. And likewise, in the practical realm, we have a knowledge of God's blueprint, the eternal law, only in a general way, as regards general principles, he says, but not as regards the particular determination of individual cases. As with empirical science, human laws are always going to be provisional, fallible, and subject to change in changing circumstances as more data comes in. So, for example, natural law might tell us that, and you can think of here it's helpful. I think you think of this as just sort of like common moral sense, or the inborn conscience that people have. The way in which we observe even 3-year-olds have a sense of fairness and so forth. So, for example, you might think that natural law tells us that people have an obligation to provide material support to the government they live under and derive advantages from. You have a duty to provide some kind of material support to that government. But it doesn't tell us what specifically kind of tax code there should be. It doesn't tell us whether there should be a value-added tax, an income tax, or whether the taxation should come through tariffs or tolls, toll booths, or whatever. Right? So the human laws are ways of specifying these general principles of the natural law. Another classic example of this is the laws on private property. We might think that there's something in human nature that makes it natural to say that people have a right to have, let's say, the fruits of their labor and so on. But how much? And how should the relationship between labor and the fruits be regulated and so on? Some of the issues that Aristotle considers, for example, in the situation of justice, that he suggests are settled by negotiation and deal making among people. Well, that's the conventional or human law, but it's guided by the natural law. It's not a completely separate body of law, but it's one that is meant for a particular purpose, namely to bring the natural law into effect in particular circumstances, a particular time, particular place. And of course, thereby it's fallible, it's tentative, it's subject to changing circumstances. What might have made sense as the law at one particular time no longer makes sense now. As to stick with the tax example, at one point in the history of the United States, it made sense to make the taxes just a matter of taxing tariffs or federal taxes. But then at some later point, it no longer made sense to support the government that way, and they instituted an income tax. So that's and now maybe, the income tax doesn't make as much sense anymore. Maybe it's better to have some other system. So that's the idea. Or maybe we should have, universal basic income or something like that instead. Okay. This leads to the first discussion question at long last. First discussion question. Do you agree with Aquinas that both natural laws and human laws exist and that each is needed? Do natural laws really exist? Do they partake of a higher reality, as Aquinas believes, whether God or something else? Maybe you believe in natural law, but you're not a theist. You don't believe in the theological account. But you have some alternative account. That'd be interesting to discuss. Is it possible to use natural law as a measure and a standard by which to judge the legitimacy of human laws? Are human laws necessary to specify natural laws? So a number of questions about the relationship between natural laws and human laws, and of course, in all cases, be prepared to explain your answers. So once again, first discussion question. Do you agree with Aquinas that both natural laws and human laws exist and that each is needed? Do natural laws really exist? Do they partake of a higher reality as Aquinas believes, whether God or something else? Is it possible to use natural law as a measure and standard by which to judge the legitimacy of human laws? Are human laws necessary to specify natural laws? Explain your answers. And then finally, divine law. So we have eternal, natural, and human laws, and they have this very convenient sort of nested relationship, with eternal being the broadest realm of law, which is basically God's divine blueprint. Natural law being our ability as human beings to partake of that divine reason and to discern aspects of God's blueprint. Human law being the way in which various aspects of the natural law are brought into effect in particular times and places, particular contingent circumstances. What's the purpose of divine law? Well, here is where we get things like the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes of Jesus. That is to say, the particular interventions of God into human history with divine revelation of a moral code. And of course, Aquinas, as an Orthodox, small o Orthodox Christian, capital C Catholic Christian, needs to have a place of this within his theory. And of course, the first objection that he gives rise to is probably an initial reaction that we might have upon hearing that Aquinas is adding a fourth category of divine law to this series, which began with the discussion of eternal law. We might think, well, wasn't the eternal law enough? Weren't we already, as it were, accounting for divine law by referring to God's eternal law? So what's the purpose of divine law? And divine law is kind of like human law in this respect, that it represents God's guidance in specific contingent historical circumstances. For example, the Mosaic law. It doesn't necessarily have any universal or eternal validity. And so here we get this division between the old law and the new law from within a Christian context. The old law being the old law of Moses and the new law being the law of Christ and the new covenant and so on. So this is a way of accounting for how something like the law of Moses is part of the divine plan, but only for a specific time and place. And that might still not seem to explain why natural law is not sufficient for God. And Aquinas gives 4 reasons to explain this. So he says that man is ordained to an end that is supernatural and hence needs assistance that is more than natural. So it's because of this account that he had given in the opening questions that we talked about in the previous video that places the end of man in God, that is in a supernatural realm, that we need assistance to get to God. In other words, that we can't rely just upon natural instruction through our partaking of the understanding of God that we have through the natural law. We need also some special additional supplementation through the divine law. Second, human judgment in instituting human laws is prone to error because of the fallibility and, of course, the sinfulness of human beings. And so the divine law comes in as a kind of check or corrective to human laws. You know, a classic example is human beings show this proneness to idolatry. And so God has to come in and have the, commandment that don't worship foreign idols. So that's the second. The third is that human law is not suited to judging the inner life of man, right? So you're never going to have Congress pass a law saying, poor people aren't allowed to be jealous of the stuff that rich people have. That doesn't make any sense. There'd be no way to enforce this law. So laws like the thou shalt not covet laws in the Ten Commandments are suited to judging the inner life of man. Or when Jesus says, don't lust, don't be angry, these are not the kinds of things that human laws can deal with. So that's the third. And then he thinks that perfect justice cannot be instituted efficiently under human law. That there's always going to be a trade-off between pursuing the ends of justice and pursuing the best condition of society. And I think this is a prime example in our present era with the lockdowns, where in pursuing an end, right, you could see as an end of justice, namely protecting the vulnerable in society, you impose a law that one could argue has done more harm than good. Hopefully this video won't be deleted from YouTube for me suggesting this. It's just an example. YouTube trust and safety team. It's just an example. But that's, I think a very vivid example for us, or at least a way in which one might argue that human law is difficult, because when you're pursuing one end, in the pursuit of that end, you might actually, cause an unjust situation. And God, of course, has the ability to, correct this. And so divine law can serve that function as well. So that's the way he frames the need for a divine law. And then the final two articles concern matters that are more of theological interest than purely ethical interest. So I'll limit myself just to a brief mention to explain why Aquinas is dealing with them. Article 5, whether there's but one divine law. So this is the question of, why is there an old covenant and a new covenant, an old law and a new law between Judaism and Christianity from a Christian perspective? And so he tries to explain this in terms of an earthly kingdom versus a heavenly kingdom, and a regimen of fear versus a regimen of love. And the short answer is it's all kind of part of the divine plan to have the eternal law, to have these two different divine laws. So in that way, you can see divine law as sort of being ensconced in the broader providence of God. And then in Article 5, whether there's a law in the fomes, that is the morbid or decayed matter of sin. Other translations say in the law of concupiscence. So concupiscence is the scholastic term for our human tendency to sin, our fallen nature, our tendency, the attractiveness of sin to human beings, our tendencies to sin. That's concupiscence. And is there a law in this? So Paul famously remarks, I see a law in my members that's distinct from the law of, God and so forth. This opposition between the spirit and the flesh, and there's one law for the flesh, another law for the spirit. What sense do we make of that within this system? And Aquinas is going to say it's not actually a law, but it's a deviation from a law. So it's not a true law. It's a kind of parasitic law. It's a negation of law in a certain sense. So that's what's going on there. But we don't have to dwell too much on that, because these are more theological rather than ethical issues, and specific to Christian theology rather than to ethical theory in general. All right, so let's conclude with the second discussion question. In your opinion, is the notion of a divine law a help or a hindrance to the perfection of human life? Do precepts derived from alleged religious revelation have a legitimate role in political life, or should they be excluded? Explain your answer. So once again, second discussion question. In your opinion, is the notion of a divine law a help or a hindrance to the perfection of human life? Do precepts derived from an alleged religious revelation have a legitimate role in political life, or should they be excluded? Explain your answer.